So this afternoon, we have two papers. The first from Dr. Fran Porter, who's going to be giving today's keynote address. Fran is Chair of Academic Oversight Committee and Senior Research Fellow at IBTS, the International Baptist Theological Study Center in Amsterdam. She describes her research as socially engaged theology, exploring the church's mission and relationship to wider society. She has a particular interest in feminist engagement with Christian faith. And currently, she's investigating responses to tainted Anabaptist theological legacies. And her presentation today is entitled A Hermeneutics of Context, Sexual Violence, Tainted Scholarship, and Putting Theology in Its Place. So, Fran, over to you.
Thank you, Ashley, and hello, everyone. Most of whom I don't know, certainly not in person. And that's one of the advantages of a conference like this on Zoom, that we get to be a group of people who perhaps couldn't all gather in one place. The slight disadvantage of a conference like this on Zoom is, of course, the subject matter. And Ashley, thank you very much for acknowledging that, that this is not just an academic exercise, and it's a matter of great sensitivity. And certainly it is not the easiest to deal with online. I don't find it the easiest to deal with online. So if that's how you feel, I'm sure you are not alone. Nevertheless, these are important things that we have to discuss, and we have all chosen to be here. Without any further ado, yes, my paper is A Hermeneutics of Context, Sexual Violence, Tainted Scholarship, and Putting Theology in Its Place. And I have put that title in the chat, just so you can get your bearings. And as is apparent from the title, my paper concerns what we do with the theology of someone who has sexually abused women. And I focus on this and not on other forms of abuse or failure, or on the sexual abuse of men and or of children, because this is the situation I am encountering most in my work. And specifically, this concerns one theologian whose work has informed both well-known and student scholars over the past 50 years, and whose theology is still being engaged and advocated. My stance in this paper is that the specific abuse perpetrated by a theologian is integral to informing our response to what we do with their theology. I am not suggesting there should be a hierarchy of abusers, with different forms of abuse given more consideration than others because of how we may, or may not, assess their severity and harm. Rather, I take this stance that the specific abuse must inform our response because I do not think it is possible to do theology in the abstract. I am not thinking here about whether there is consistency between what we say and what we do, hence pointing to the obvious mismatch between personal ethical misbehavior and the espoused theology of theologians who abuse. Rather, I mean that all human theologizing, regardless of discipline or universal claims, inevitably exists only in material and social contexts, and the interaction with these contexts is relevant to how theology is produced and how it is received, regardless of whether this is acknowledged or not. Specifically, therefore, the prevalence and need for prevention of sexual violence against women is the context in which we must decide what to do with the theology from any scholar who has been sexually abusive. The person in question here is North American Mennonite theologian John Howard Yoder, who died in 1997. John Howard Yoder held senior positions in the American Academy, both at what is now the Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary and at the University of Notre Dame, and he spent a year as president of the Society for Christian Ethics. His involvement in ecumenical matters included some 20 years' engagement with the World Council of Churches. He wrote 17 books. the best known being The Politics of Jesus, first published in 1972. His insistence that Jesus' life and teaching are normative for contemporary Christian social ethics, particularly expressed in this book, were hugely influential. Numerous theologians have stated their indebtedness to the ideas of this scholar, whom many considered the preeminent pacifist theologian of 20th century Christian ethics. Accolades for him abound. What we now know is that John Howard Yoder was a sexual predator who, over at least 3 decades of his adult life, abused his authority and theology to violent ends against women. In 2015, Rachel Waltner-Goosen's historical investigation into the Mennonite Church's response to the sexual violence committed by John Howard Yoder was published, making publicly available a comprehensive account of his abuse and the unfolding story of largely failed attempts to hold him accountable. The report provides a substantial description of his known abuse, starting in the 1970s, giving sufficient evidence to see his actions as that of a sexual predator. While a predator is someone who preys on the vulnerabilities of others, an individual who victimizes others, the term sexual predator describes an individual with repeated sexual violations or offences with one individual over time or with multiple individuals. Complaints were received about John Howard Yoder's behaviour from Africa, Canada, Europe, in French, German and English languages, South America, Central America and Israel, as well as the United States of America, and is thought to have involved at least 100 women. His abuse was directed to women students and women in various staff positions. Ruth Crowell has described him as conducting, quote, his own personal sexual guerrilla war against bright, gifted female students and institutionally employed churchwomen. The fallout of his actions reverberates still within the Mennonite Church and beyond. Choosing to call John Howard Yoder a sexual predator is not done to vilify him or to reduce his existence to this one thing. However, the language of sexual predator serves to remove any representation of his behavior that attempts to present it in a different frame to other sexual predators. For example, that he was a theologian whose behavior failed to live up to his theological ethics. As I shall explain, this is not a tenable position, given that he presented theological justification for his abuse. Indeed, he never acknowledged what happened as abuse, but presented it as part of the freedom of the gospel. Even without this rationalization, the idea of a theologian who fell short of his own Christian ethics would be an inadequate and inaccurate way of describing what happened. Of course, it is true that no one is perfect, which is a point that has been made to justify continuing to use his scholarship. But as Randall Rouser has plainly stated, yes, we are all sinners, but we are not all serial sexual predators. Accurate naming is important, not to dehumanize him or to distance ourselves, but to enable an adequate response. And this too is why the language of sexual violence against women is important in describing his actions, and euphemisms such as sexual misconduct or inappropriate sexual activity are not only inadequate but misleading. Naming what we are talking about here as sexual violence or sexual abuse of women is important to acknowledge, because such abuse is fundamentally about power. As Ruth Crowell explains, sexual abuse is the methodology by which sexually or gender abusive perpetrators seek to manipulate, control, and dominate the lives of their chosen victims. And Rachel Waltner-Goosen's account reveals the manipulation and power John Howard Yoder exerted not only in carrying out his abuse, but in avoiding accountability. At this point, I want to make a comment about my own positionality. I never met John Howard Yoder nor read his work directly in my early theological study, although among my friends and colleagues are those who have done both. In reading his work more recently, I recognize his influence over scholarship and ideas with which I have previously engaged. I do not, however, find myself faced with the dilemma present for others in working out how to respond to knowing that the person whose theology has been so formative for their thinking, and indeed their lives, did so much harm. And I know those who have removed his books from their shelves and those who continue to advocate his work. While for me, this is not a situation of personal betrayal, this does not mean I have a disinterested position. Rather, I advocate for a hermeneutics of context that takes seriously the prevalence and need for prevention of sexual violence, indeed all violence, against women, because of what to do so means for us all now, in the theology we engage with, in the theology we produce, and in the way we do our theology. And this will shape the conclusions I come to about the place of tainted scholarship in this case. I think there is an assumed default position behind the discourse around whether there is a rightful use beyond wrongful acts. The question presumes that our dilemma arises because the scholarship itself is good, and we are trying to decide if that good is now tainted beyond use because of the behaviour of its author. In the case of the scholar I am considering, the majority, or perhaps more accurately the loudest, I'm not quite sure, I would say perhaps the majority opinion has been that his work has not only been valuable before his abuse became widely known, but that it continues to be so. In 2015, before Rachel Waltner-Goossen's work appeared, but with sufficient knowledge available to those involved, J. Denny Weaver edited a book that focused on bringing a new and unifying perspective to John Howard Yoder's methodology and theology. In the preface, the editor states, "All authors in this volume are profoundly grateful for Yoder's theological influence and welcome the opportunity to contribute to this volume on his theology and its legacy." In 2022, Brad East explained of his new work comparing three theologians' approaches to the Bible. "The primary substantive reason that Yoder is part of this book is that I believe his work has something constructive to say to the Church and to the Theological Academy." The way these two texts deal with the theologian's sexual violence is similar. The former, while acknowledging the abuse from the start, brings it into the book's conversation only in the last two of the 13 main chapters. These 13 chapters are all authored by men, and so the book includes, following the conclusion, an afterword written by Lisa Schursch to bring an analysis from women scholars. The second book I refer to has a long essay as an excursus in the middle of the book that precedes discussion of John Howard Yoder's scholarship used for the book's argument. That latter discussion is not without critique of his theology, and passing reference is made to how the critique is highlighted by the wicked and tragic events of his life, but the chapter text would stand without any such reference. The excursus is aptly named. It provides a substantive discussion of the implications of the abuse, but as a digression, for this is not integrated into the main text. I cite these two examples as they illustrate an approach that seeks not to ignore the abuse and endeavours to take it seriously, while nevertheless largely continuing to engage the scholarship without reference to it, convinced the scholarship continues to, quote, "offer insights into the reality of Christ worth receiving, however critically, both now and into the future," end quote. Put another way, the ideas of the theologian in question, quote, "remain perceptive and helpful regardless of what I learn about his life," unquote. For these male theologians, there is some intrinsic good in the scholarship in question, and their struggles are with how to justify continuing to draw on that good in the light of the sexual violence of its author. In contrast to this focus on the value of the scholarship in question, which suggests it contains an enduring positive contribution or unimpeachable good, Sarah Shin suggests response be oriented around the scale and scope of influence the theologies in question have held. This scale and scope not only concerns theological ideas, but how these have been nurtured within academic and ecclesial settings and practices. The problem, she argues, is that a focus on value means either that such scholarship is deemed too valuable to ignore, which is in effect to value the perpetrator over the victim, or it is deemed unusable because it is assumed to be implicated in the abuse and must therefore be rejected as no longer valuable. In contrast, focusing on the influence of theology and not its inherent value enables proper attention to be given to the ways in which our theology making is infected by, quote, human moral failings and the systems built around their ideas. The examples previously cited that see value in John Howard Yoder's work also emphasize its influence, but with the assumption that this too is positive. An advantage of the focus on influence outlined by Sarah Shin is that it recognizes that not all things we inherit are good, but may nevertheless still impact us. They are therefore in need of redress and not simply to be discarded unexamined as the alternative to embracing as an unquestionable good. Wrestling with both value and influence of scholarship is brought together by Karen Guth in her framing of tainted legacies as a distinct moral problem, which in her context of the USA is common to the Confederate monuments debate, the matter of slavery reparations in educational institutions, and sexual violence perpetrated by various artists, and one theologian in particular, namely John Howard Yoder. For Karen Guth, the question is, how do we best engage with legacies that wield irrevocable influence or make invaluable contributions and cause unjust harm? Further, how to do so without causing additional harm and inflicting further suffering. And her concern is that this moral problem points to the need not only to redress past and present injuries of tainted legacies, but also to, quote, consider the deeper structural injustices that enabled them, enacting a justice that wards against those harms in the future, end quote. And this is because abusive legacies of whatever kind exist within conceptual and material frameworks, our ways of thinking and doing, and it is these that need to be interrogated for the extent to and ways in which they have enabled the abuse in the first place. And it is here I suggest that a hermeneutics of context, which foregrounds the prevalence and prevention of sexual violence against women, is critical when considering what we do with the work of scholars who have abused women. Rather than concern being focused on the status of the offender or their theological or reputational legacy, this approach seeks to interrogate the scholarship for the role it plays, either in terms of its content or its performance within the Theological Academy of Christian Church, but the role it plays in perpetuating or preventing violence against women. This means their theology cannot be considered in the abstract, but in terms of how it is received now, with the knowledge we have of the predatory behaviour of its author. Put simply, or put bluntly, even, we should not evaluate it outside of this bigger context. And this moves the focus from the one carrying out the abuse to those who have or are at risk of the experience of being abused, and what is required to prevent sexual abuse now and in the future in Christian and wider social contexts. And I suggest three things that are hermeneutics of context that foregrounds the prevalence and prevention of sexual violence against women means for how we deal with John Howard Yoder's scholarship. These are a decentering of theology, a refocusing of theology, and a revisiting of what we envision as good. First, I suggest a hermeneutics of context means it is necessary initially to decenter the role of theology in the abuse. This may seem strange given how John Howard Yoder used theological justifications for his actions and for avoiding accountability. He circulated a paper to particular women that claimed, I am being led into a kind of theological, ethical, and psychological study for which I need your help. prompted, he claimed, by feedback from women, which concerned what the single person should do with his sexuality. In his conversations with women he harmed, he gave theological justifications for his behaviour. Ruth Kral records, women victimized by him testified to the church that Yoda used his intellectual abilities and his theology, in addition to physically aggressive or violent behaviours, to seduce and harass women. They also testified that when confronted about the inappropriate nature of his behaviour, he subsequently used his brilliant intellect and his theological ethical theories to rationalise his behaviour as somehow appropriate, religiously desirable, and ethically justified. What he conceptualized as an experimental form of sexual ethics involves an appeal for women, to women for, quote, only thanks to your friendship, sisterhood, can I do the theology. He explained his actions to his seminary president as working from theological premises that included certain interpretations of the writings of Paul and the life of Jesus. Rachel Waltner-Guson describes his so-called experimentation as a theological idea. The fact that this particular theology is obnoxious to us does not make it any less theological. Nevertheless, my argument is that characterizing the abuse as primarily or essentially a problem of bad theology is an inadequate analysis. Rather, the lens of sexual violence sees theology as a tool of the person who abuses, regardless, I suggest, of the place theology has in their rationalization or perpetration of the abuse. In other words, the key to stopping the abuse was not solely in winning a theological argument. If it were, evidence suggests this would be unsuccessful in this case. John Howard Yoder has been described as a man who never seemed to have changed his mind, who, when he asked for feedback or dialogue, what he in fact was looking for was support to make his argument stronger. It has been said he was absolutely not open to real dialogue. He could snub or bypass other people's questions and objections. Further, he often pushed his interlocutor in a direction that had to have felt coercive to that person, to the extent that the interlocutor would abandon his own terminology or rephrase his questions before dialogue could be possible. Similar dynamics of how he engaged with alternative positions to his own are evident in the way he obfuscated the various disciplinary processes attempted. Here too, theological argumentation functioned to circumvent intervention that would have protected women. Matthew 18, verses 15 to 20, was used to frame the first attempts at accountability, the application of which John Howard Yoder debated with the relevant parties. For years, he argued that the fact that women he harmed were unwilling to meet him one-on-one in a process of reconciliation made any disciplinary process against him impossible. And this, of course, completely overlooks that it was not in the women's interest to meet in this way. To cite Rachel Waltner-Guson, what victim of sexual abuse wished for face-to-face contact with Yoda, either alone or in the presence of his institutional backers? That theology was given a central role, both to his carrying out the abuse and avoiding accountability, only served to allow harm to women to continue. As Rachel Waltner-Guson comments, casting the problem and its potential solution as biblical obfuscated actual abuses that were occurring on the seminary campus, in young women's apartments, and in closed-door office spaces and hotel rooms around the world. Hence, rather than focusing on theological argument or giving theology a central role, even arguably any role in the first instance, naming what was happening as sexual violence is the starting point for determining intervention to stop what was happening. The focus needed to be on the evidence provided by the women who were harassed and abused, and not on the theological justifications of the person carrying out the abuse. It needed to be on the safety of the women being targeted, and not on the reputation of the theologian being abusive. And the focus of institutional integrity needed to be on how women experienced sexual violence were treated, and not on androcentric values of a masculinist academy that prized theological output and influence of its male star at the cost of women's well-being. Of course, theology could play a constructive role in all this. The fact that it did not means our theologizing, both its content and production, is implicated and does need to be examined. For at the same time as arguing for theology to be decentered in the first instance, theology remains an integral part of what we are dealing with here. Which brings me to my second point in using a hermeneutics of context. What does this mean when we do focus on the theology? For we have choices in how we do this. Rachel Waltner-Goosen recounts an incident from Ethel Yake Metzler, one of the married women targeted by John Howard Yoder, with phone calls to her home asking for lunch dates. On a paper he sent her on heterosexual intimacy outside of marriage, she scrawled the words, "This is ridiculous." And this is one of the many instances where women resisted his harassment attempts to groom them, although often he persisted despite their objections. Ethel Yeaker Metzler had known him since their student college days and considered him a peer, not an authority figure, and later reflected that this made it easier for her to reject his advances. And this points to how theology does not exist in the abstract, but is both generated and received in particular contexts. In this case, we have a man who, in the words of Jamie Pitts, was authorized by the church to be a radical Christian intellectual. Part of his coercion of women was to present his ideas as on the cutting edge of Christian sexual ethics, for which he needed their help. So we have a highly accredited Christian scholar who was seen not just as an authority figure, but indeed as the authority figure, approaching women with his theological ideas around sexuality, singleness, and community that he described to them as a grand noble experiment. While not intended for public distribution, there are a number of his papers and correspondence that detail his theological reasoning and which he employed to target women and justify his actions when challenged by institutional authorities. In a 2019 doctoral thesis, William Hutto provides a critical appraisal of this material, its internal logic, its deficiencies and deceptions, and the ways in which it departed from Christian orthodoxy and orthopraxy. And this is important work, for it uncovers what William Hutto describes as types of manipulation, both of God's truth and of God's children, evident in this theology that John Howard Yoder produced. In considering what to do with this man's theology, I have started with reference to his unpublished and relatively small amount of work used directly in furtherance of his abuse, and not his main and considerable body of more public scholarship. This is a deliberate choice that I think is required by a hermeneutics of context which foregrounds the prevalence and prevention of sexual violence against women. This choice contrasts with initial approaches to his theology, which tended to isolate his so-called sexual ethics from his public corpus of work, on the basis that this latter was not implicated in his abuse. That rests on an unexamined premise that I shall return to shortly. It is, however, understandable that standing from a place which had imbibed John Howard Yoder's scholarship and had no reason to question its trustworthiness and many reasons to own its value, that the unpublished essays are seen as the outliers that need to be tested against the widely lauded body of work and not the other way round. But that is not where we are now. Our knowledge of the range of his theological outputs, I suggest, means we stand in a different place, and one that is particularly relevant when considering whether or not to continue to draw on his theology, and if so, in what ways. It has been aptly said that there is simply no way to tell the story of 20th century historic peace church theology, much less to appropriate it, without drawing on Yoder's thought. For any studies in this area, therefore, he cannot simply be excluded, as in left out of the record. But the same is true for his actions as a sexual predator. At the very least, for those who choose to use his scholarship for its own sake, the fuller story must be told. and not as an asterisk, as Stanley Hauerwas unfortunately once referred to it, but as an integral part of the story. I am, however, arguing for something more than adding in the story of his abuse into the story of his contribution to theology. For if the story of Mennonite peace theology cannot be told without including John Howard Yoder, nor is there a way to speak of the struggles of Mennonite women against religiously and theologically supported violence without drawing on the story of the abuse carried out by this particular man and the institutional failures to stop it or properly hold him to account. This is not an isolated case of violence against women for Mennonites any more than are high-profile named abusive pastors and theologians in other denominations. Violence against women, including sexual violence, is everywhere. And telling this pervasive story requires uncovering theological and institutional veneers that overlook not only abuse, but the conditions in which it emerges and thrives. This includes an examination of pacifist theologies and their lack of attention to violence against women. And it certainly involves scrutinizing any theologian's work on non-violence when that theologian is aptly identified as a sexual predator. Naming John Howard Yoder's abuse as violence necessarily means that his work on non-violence cannot be quarantined from either his actions or his theology that was used to harass and abuse women. When we foreground a critique of sexual violence and therefore tell the story of women targeted and harmed by John Howard Yoder, this enables a different narration of the story of his scholarship, which in turn, I suggest, offers a way to shape how we treat it now. He produced his self-termed, excuse me, He produced his self-termed Grand Noble Experiment writings in the 10 years following the publication of his much-acclaimed The Politics of Jesus. During these years, while continuing to teach at AMBS, he became a full professor at Notre Dame, was a contributing editor Sojourners, and joined the editorial board of the Journal of Religious Ethics, among other things. Put another way, at the same time as he was pursuing his academic career, building his reputation and enjoying the privileges of his position, he was pursuing women with harassment and abuse, intentionally using his theological prowess and Christian status to target women for abuse. While I do not claim to speak for them, evidence suggests that many of these women would not have been able to separate his lauded public work and reputation from his theologically justified actions involved in their abusive encounters with him. Nor, I would argue, should we when we consider his scholarship now. Thirdly, I want to consider what a hermeneutics of context might mean for thinking about evaluating what is good in terms of the theological contribution in question here. We have plenty of testimony of those who have been influenced by John Howard Yoder's work and found it constructively formative for their own thinking, ecclesiology, and discipleship. A hermeneutics of context, however, that foregrounds the prevalence and prevention of sexual violence, and indeed all violence against women, involves different criteria for assessing the good that has been received. For while we are left with individuals and church communities that are shaped by his thinking in ways people consider helpful, even life-transforming, we are also left with both people and churches that are impoverished, indeed damaged, not just by his actions, but also by his theology, and from the treatment they received when they sought various avenues to have the abuse stopped or be exposed. This is summarized by Lisa Schursch as someone who was born and raised in the Mennonite Church. I have seen the negative effects of Yoder's assaults, she says, and the church's delayed response impact 3 generations of Mennonite women over the last 30 years in over a dozen Mennonite institutions. Some of Yoder's victims were his peers in his own generation. Some were his students in the next generation. Women in both generations who spoke about the assaults experienced significant backlash. In today's world, a third generation of women theologians continues to be marginalized for their critique of Yoder and the church. Today's Bible and theology departments at Mennonite institutions are predominantly male. In my opinion, Yoda's assaults on women and the broader church's protection of Yoda at the expense of women's safety are important reasons why many talented Mennonite women, pacifist theologians, have left the Mennonite church and have moved on to other denominations. I am not suggesting here a balancing between goods and harms, not least because such an approach privileges John Howard Yoda's scholarship. It frames the argument with a presumption of a good body of scholarship and asks what happens to that in the light of the harm inflicted by its author, a stance I have already suggested needs revised. I am rather arguing that we are impoverished in our vision of the good if we cannot imagine that there might be other possibilities that could have come into being for the benefit of Christian witness and the flourishing of the church if this scholar had been stopped, even if, while not inevitable, that meant also a stopping of his scholarship. Can we imagine what 50 years of women in theological scholarship and church leadership would have given us now? What more might women have contributed to pacifist understandings, to ecclesial practices, let alone women's well-being and combating sexual and other violence against women and girls, if there had been 3 or 4 more generations of women scholars engaging in academic and pastoral leadership? This is difficult to argue. It is an argument from silence. We cannot know. And the challenges to dismantle patriarchal paradigms that explicitly or implicitly foster environments where men exert power over women and which are embedded in Christian thinking and practice cannot be addressed by simply or only adding in women. But it is to suggest that we rethink our framing of what we identify as good to allow for other possibilities. This is about how we view past goods and how we might envision future ones. Put another way, the prominence given to this man and his scholarship, however unwittingly, facilitated his harassment and abuse. In terms of how we view his scholarship now, in the light of what we know, is to continue to laud it as good and central, albeit with the usual critical theological engagement, to continue to eclipse other voices, not least those that protest sexual violence against women. And with this question in mind, I return to Sarah Shin's critique of using value to assess scholarship from theologians who have abused. She argued a focus on value means either that such scholarship is considered too valuable to ignore, which results in the perpetrator being valued over the victim, or it is viewed as unusable because it is implicated in the abuse and must therefore be rejected as no longer valuable. I suggest that a hermeneutics of context means a third option is open to us with respect to value. It may be that having scrutinized John Howard Yoda's work, it is concluded that there is much of his work that is without the corruption that facilitated his abuse. In other words, there is usable good. Nevertheless, the option remains. When we own that theology is not done in the abstract, and we foreground the context we are in of the prevalence and need for prevention of sexual violence against women, that the choice can be made not to use his scholarship for its own sake, despite its perceived value. To do this would be a conscious act of resistance. He and his scholarship would not be erased from the story of 20th century theology, ecclesiology, and Christian ethics, but it would be owned as part of the foregrounding of the protest about and prevention of sexual violence. To do this would be to acknowledge the public dimension of sexual violence. Restricting sexual violence to a personal matter perceives it to be about isolated individuals and not about wider social practices. However, the public context matters. What public statement are Christian academies and churches making in continuing to use as an authoritative theological source the scholarship of someone who is aptly described as a sexual predator and who never accepted that his actions were abusive? What are theological institutions conveying to their students, both women and men, when they continue to draw on, even make central, theology and Christian ethics from someone whose abusive actions were embedded within his academic career, which is, I have argued, how a context of hermeneutics narrates his theological output? If we foreground the prevalence and need for prevention of sexual violence against women, then even before considering his scholarship in its own terms, a prior decision needs to be made whether this is even what we should do. So to conclude, starting from the stance that we do not do our theology in a vacuum, I have argued that how we respond to the scholarship in question here must be informed by our context of the prevalence and need for prevention of sexual violence against women. This means we neither ignore this man's scholarship and hence also the abuse he committed, nor continue to use his work and with his abuse noted, perhaps discussed, but ultimately making minimal impact on how his work is received. Rather, it means we reshape how we respond. In the first instance, I argue for a decentering of theology because the story of theology in this case has been one where it has been used to obfuscate, and arguably still does, the abuse experienced and to derail justice. I also argue that there needs to be a re-narration of the story of this person's scholarship in a way that more accurately portrays the entanglement of his theology, his academic career, and his abusive actions. And it is this story that should be owned by academy and church as part of dealing with the reality of sexual violence against women. And finally, I propose that even if the scholarship in question is judged to retain ongoing value for the academy and church, that it is not used as a theological source. And the choice to not use this theology is not because we want to keep ourselves pure from its taint, not because we want to distance ourselves from being associated with its influence, and not because we are claiming that we are without sin. It is not because it is easiest to remove it from our purview and the life of our academies and churches so that we do not have to deal with his sexual predation. Nor, for some, will it be because we think it no longer has value. Rather, in the context of the prevalence and need for prevention of sexual violence against women, our not using it serves as a public act of resistance. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran. All right. Thank you for that thoughtful paper. We've got about 15 minutes for questions, and if I could perhaps launch the ball. I think there's just enough of us that I'd like to encourage us to perhaps use the hand raise function, and I will call out your name as I see people present, and then please unmute yourself. If you'd rather not unmute yourself, you're also free to ask a question in the chat, and we'll be watchful and pick those up. But you made a very interesting comment that Fran, that I just wanted to chase down among many interesting comments. You said pacifist theologies have neglected violence against women. Is that, if, assuming I heard you rightly there, is that because John Howard Yoder has been so key to so much pacifist theology, or is there something else going on?
No, I think there's something else going on. Well, can you separate those? That's interesting. It's not that there has been no attention, but it's come from women scholars and it's not been mainstream. I think I'm referring to arguments, pacifist arguments, largely are to do with state war and on that kind of level. And in terms of interpersonal violence and gender violence, it's not part of the mainstream. Um, I mean, it would be to go into detail into the brief mentions that the Yoda might touch on that or whatever, which are unhelpful contributions completely. But generally speaking, I mean, others might disagree, and I think it's more recent. I think it wouldn't be true, but I'm thinking in terms of, post Second World War and the dominance. You might get a chapter of violence against women, but it's also it's separate from the main kind of pacifist dialogue. There are those of you here on screen I know who are more familiar with all that literature than I am. So please, correct if you may, but I'm not. I mean, I don't come across it writings, and it is a common critique that women scholars and feminist scholars will make about Christian theological pacifist arguments.
Thank you. Yeah, that's interesting. Please, questions and responses. Oh, Helen, yes. I think I was trying to encourage people to use the reactions hands up button, but
Sorry.
yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Fran. I've been taking notes all the way through. It's really, really helpful. I'm interested in the kind of economic consequences of what you propose and thinking. So I'm wondering about whether any publishers have withdrawn from selling Yoda's books. And yes, I'm just interested in the capacity, especially when somebody's still alive, the capacity to actually to hurt them. And that's not a criticism. That's actually, that's quite, I find that quite an exciting possibility that withdrawing use of somebody's work can actually make a financial can be a punitive thing.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, the case of Yoda, I mean, there's obviously he died in 97, but then there is his works have carried on and so on. And Herald Press, who published most of his work from the States, continued publishing. And did they start putting a disclaimer or a comment or something? But basically continued publishing till only a few years ago. Quite recently, it's 2022 even. I'd have to check the date, but it really is quite recent that they have, apart from he has done a translation of the Schleitheim Confession from the German, it's not the only one that exists, but it's rated quite highly, and I think that one it might be one that they're continuing. But they have, I don't know what they've done with back stocks, but they've certainly ceased publication. On that case. I mean, for me, in terms of livelihoods and careers and thinking along that way, a group that have been affected, perhaps not so much now, but certainly in the past, were students, for example, halfway through advanced studies, and then everything explodes in 2015. I mean, that's a dreadful situation to find yourself in. I mean, it's interesting. I didn't have chance to sort of and on screen it's difficult to do, but I am still coming across people who've heard of John Howard Yoder, who use his work, and who have heard nothing, not a thing, about his abusive behavior. And especially when that's with students, I mean, they need to be prepared. It's not about telling them you must not use this, but you're moving into an academy where questions might be raised and you must be prepared for this. Plus, from our own ethical standpoint, what do we think? We need time to think about what we want to do with these scholars and their works. There's a whole question about whether we name or not. And I will continue as far as I can to have his name somewhere in a keyword, because I want people to come across there's facts about him, they're in the public domain, and worldwide his reach students do not know. So I think, and Brad East, I mentioned his book, he's very honest and open. He obviously studied Yoda for his PhD work. He's now turned it into a book, and he and he says he's aware this could be his own self-interest, that he's just pursuing it, and all the rest of it. So I think there's all sorts of others. I mean, what do you do? If you're a teacher, I think it's a lot easier because you have other sources and different ways of teaching. But yeah, if you have spent your life, although personally, I mean, I always find that quite strange. As someone who is that one doesn't turn and study something else, so I'm not quite sure that I'm that convinced by that argument. But there are people, we call them Yodean scholars, or they call themselves Yodean scholars, that this is they've invested in. What impact would it have on secondary economics? I'm not sure. I'm not
Thank
sure,
you.
but I think, yeah, I think that's
It's interesting to compare what you said about Herald Press with the alacrity with which the pillar commentary was pulled off on somebody who plagiarized, and probably unwittingly plagiarized. And that was just pulled right off the shelves instantly
Yeah.
and pulped. You can't get hold of it anymore. It's interesting to compare those two.
Because plagiarism is such a no-no. I mean, and so rightly so, if it, especially if it's intentional, and even if it's unwitting, it has to be corrected. But yes.
Yeah, thank you.
John.
Hi, sorry, I'm playing with Windows 11. I just changed my operating system. Fran, thank you. It was a really great talk. It's not the first time I've heard you speak about this issue, but it was at length and in detail, really very engaging. I suppose I've got a couple of thoughts and a question really back to you. And first of all, I suppose it's just a response. I am one of those people who thinks that it's impossible to tell the story of late 20th century political theology without some reference to John Howard Yoder. And you kind of tacitly recognize that. And I think it does present a challenge for those of us working specifically on violence and more broadly in political theology. But you're absolutely right. I think also that there's a need to do that in a way which names the abuse and the sexual violence and how that is bound up in the scholarship. And so I think what that means in practice is that there's certain forms of usage of Yoda which are very difficult to do. Like if you've got a short, tightly focused journal article, it'd be quite hard to, unless it was on a very specific theme, it would be quite hard to use his work. So I'm thinking to my own experience of doing that in the book I published last year, where I spend 2 or 3 pages kind of going over Rachel Waltner-Gooson's report and the whole context and how it relates to the wider theology. And I wonder if certain shorter formats, that'd be very difficult to do. So what that gets me thinking about is whether we can be a bit more specific about some of the kinds of usage where usage goes on of Yoda's work, which are reasonable and those that are not. And what I hear from you, and this is the question really, and I've heard from others when talking about this, is that there are definitely certain forms that really are objectively wrong. So any heroicization, any kind of we unfortunately we in the academic field there is this kind of heroic use of scholars. I don't think it's ever a good idea, quite frankly. But anything with the name, when I was at Notre Dame as a postdoc, there was the Yoda dialogues. I'm quite sure they don't exist anymore. But anything of that type really should not go on. Societies, journals, chairs, positions where the naming and the heroicization, I think we can be fairly categorical about the problems with that. What I wouldn't want to hold back is the emergence of critical scholarship on Yoda and his work and his contribution to Mennonite theology in the late 20th, early 21st century. And I do fear at the moment there is the risk that could happen. That emergence, because part of the problem with Yoda, it seems to me, that was that during his lifetime, there was nowhere near enough critical scholarship and critique of his work. He was held in reverence in Mennonite circles. And when that began to emerge after his death, even before the Rachel Waltner-Gooson's report came out and it became public, then that was an important move to critique his work. So I suppose the question, very long-winded, but is to say, can we be more specific about the kinds of usage which we'd want to see and those that we absolutely can say categorically should not take place? Would you go a bit further than you did in the talk on that?
I partly answer that, and then I want to backtrack and take a wider lens. I mean, there's some very good work done by Isaac Samuel Villegas, which has shown precisely why Yoda's work around reconciliation and the Matthew passage are not to be trusted, and how he manipulated that in his writings, and he's done a really careful evidence trail. Who knows, is it 25 years' time, when the remainder of his private papers are released, they're embargoed at the moment, what else we might discover, because obviously they've been embargoed for a reason. So I can't know, we don't know. But why are they embargoed when so much else is now available? Possibly because other people have got copies and whatever. But there's obviously some stuff that we don't get to see. So you know, you may rethink that question in that, like, I don't know, and I don't know one way or the other, but there is more to learn. So some of that, I think, but you see, and there'll be people who, and I think his work has been criticized on a number of levels. His lack of attention to communal life in church. I mean, there's quite a lot where you're quite right. But you see, the question of why wasn't it critiqued further at the time is partly what interests me. So I'm kind of avoiding you. And partly, as I understand it, he came in at a certain time, at a certain need, in a post-war American Mennonite context, trying to adjust to the changing society. And there's an argument made. I mean, Susan Brooks Thistlethwaite, I think, is it the one who makes it that, or maybe, no, I don't think it is her. So sorry, scrap that. But there is an argument made that, in a sense, you know, peace theology in the second half of the 20th century is kind of a masculinist attempt, a way of being, you know, masculine in a post-World War kind of context, and to you sort of things. There's a whole lot of other stuff going on, and terrible need, which we can accept, of a church trying to find its way, how to be its self-understanding of an ecclesiology in this society. And here comes something that seems to fill the void, and so they kind of jump on it. So I suppose I'm not very helpful to you asking your specific questions, partly because I don't know Yoda's work well enough in the detail, although I recognize it all over the place. And but I think it's what we do with theology and theologians is a fascinating thing. And you're right, the heroes, and if it's got, oh, somebody wrote this review or somebody's endorsed this book, then it must be all right, or I'll take a look and I won't bother with others, you know. And I'm not quite sure how we get and why we need our heroes and why we lose our critical voice. The thing is, what we do know anecdotally and a few bits and pieces in writing is that actually, people did try to criticize Yoda and he shut them down. He just wouldn't have it, you know. So, and even respectable scholars whose work I would also value, you know, his behavior towards them, um, you know, even the contents of I mean, Willard Swartley's work. I mean, he's a great theologian, no longer with her, but even his work, you know, he has been critical of some aspects, not all of it, of the politics of Jesus, but engaging in some aspects, and Yoda just shut him out, you know, wouldn't have anything to do with it. So there's something about, I don't know, what was going on, authority, hierarchy, just plain determination to ignore and carry on regardless, thick-skinnedness, I don't know. So that's not really helpful, but that always behind that question, are there some bits rather than others? But I still think I appreciate that I think there's this sense that, or maybe we're getting to the stage now where people are just, for some good instincts, they don't want anything to do with it, and that's a mistake. I mean, I think that's a mistake. I'm not actually arguing for that, because I think then also the abuse he committed and the whole prevalence of sexual violence among Christian circles is being overlooked. So I mean, I think that's for a reason that it needs to be addressed. And so I'm not arguing that it isn't. And if that means engaging with some of his theological ideas and where he might have got some of his varieties from, fair enough. But I do think, and I think it's really hard to do that, and not just get caught up in the theology itself for its own sake. And I'm kind of holding out against that, not because I'm denying in the abstract it might have some value, but because we don't do theology in the abstract. So I'd probably be having a bit of, you know, pulling slightly in the other direction to where you're going, without wanting to delete him completely, because I don't think you can do that. But I do want, as a matter of principle, know there are consequences, and we will not do this, not because we're trying to be superior, guiltless, perfect, or any of that, but because we must resist. Because I think there's too much toleration of, there was so much toleration of what he did, so much toleration. you know, and women are taught, oh, well, nothing really happened, and it's not taken seriously, you know, and I just think how, you know, treating his theology as theology without the bigger story and a part of this bigger picture is actually to encourage that. But I'm not sure that that would be a majority view. But yeah, I think that's where I'm at the moment. I mean, my thinking has changed, but that's where I'm at the moment. I think somebody just has to say stop, no. And how do we do that?
Thank you so much. I think we're out of time for questions at the moment. Perhaps some of this can be picked up in tomorrow night's panel, if there's space. Thank you again, Fran. Let's once again show our appreciation